Let's continue our conversation about neurons and the nervous system. Neurons are nerve cells, and they engage in electrical transmission and the release of chemical signals or signaling molecules. More specifically, those are known as neurotransmitters. So what we see in this picture right here are two neurons. The one on the left is the pseudo-unipolar neuron, or unipolar neuron, if you will, that we looked at in a previous video. And the one on the right represents a multipolar neuron. For this video and for this lecture, it doesn't really matter which type of neurons we have. But since I've drawn a unipolar neuron, you should think of this as being in the peripheral nervous system, specifically a sensory neuron that's picking up stimuli outside of the body, sending it to the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and the brain. The space between these two neurons, or any two neurons, or a neuron and an effector organ, or an effector cell, is known as a synapse. So this space right here is a synapse, which is an extremely small, narrow space, roughly 20 to 40 nanometers. A nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. And to put that on a more understandable scale, the width of a human hair is about 75,000 nanometers wide. Because this space is known as a synapse, we refer to this neuron as the presynaptic neuron. And we refer to this neuron as the postsynaptic neuron. So this neuron will release neurotransmitters, which we see here, held in what are known as synaptic vesicles within the axon terminals, specifically within the swelling known as the axon knobs or terminal knobs. And generally, I do refer to these still as axon terminals. So the axon terminals contain the synaptic vesicles, which contain themselves a neurotransmitter. So these small dots within the synaptic vesicles are the neurotransmitters. There's over 100 known neurotransmitters in the body. Acetylcholine and norepinephrine are two types of neurotransmitters, and we'll talk about a few more during this video. Once again, presynaptic neuron is going to release neurotransmitters that bind to receptors on the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron or receptors on the cell body. Now, they're generally, or frequently, I should say, more than two neurons in series. There could be 3 or 4 neurons in series. And what I mean by that, we could end up seeing something like this, where we actually have a synapse right here between these two neurons, and we have a synapse right here between these two neurons, which now changes things a little bit. This is still a presynaptic neuron because it's before this synapse. This is certainly a postsynaptic neuron because it's after this synapse. But this neuron in the middle is now a postsynaptic neuron because it's after this synapse. But it's also a presynaptic neuron because it's before this synapse. So this is a presynaptic neuron. This is both a pre- and postsynaptic neuron. And this is a postsynaptic neuron. Now, if that first neuron has an action potential, depolarizes, it will release the neurotransmitters. It is that depolarization event in the neuron, specifically down that axon, that releases the neurotransmitters from the synaptic vesicle. Those neurotransmitters will do one of two things to this green postsynaptic neuron. It may cause that neuron to become excited, and when we say a neuron or a cell becomes excited, that is suggesting it is going to have its own depolarization event, which very well may cause the release of neurotransmitters. But one thing I want to point out, the release of neurotransmitters binding to another neuron can be inhibitory. That is to say, right here, you do not see a depolarization event right here. So one thing I want to do is back up and look at this slide just to review some critical points. At the top here, we see a graph with an action potential. As it rises, that's the depolarization phase. As it returns back to its resting state, that is the repolarization phase. The horizontal lines represent the resting state, which we see right here. In the resting state, the cell is polarized. That is to say, there's a difference in charge between the outside and the inside. When the cell depolarizes, meaning there's no longer a difference in the state of the charge of the cell between the inside and the outside, we refer to this now as depolarized. And then when it returns back to its resting state, it's polar again or repolarized. So if we look once again here, this neurotransmitter excites this downstream neuron, causing this to depolarize. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, and aspartate is an excitatory neurotransmitter in the spinal cord. Like I said, there's over 100 neurotransmitters, but those two in particular are excitatory. That is to say, when they bind to the postsynaptic neuron, they're going to excite or cause that neuron to depolarize, which will cause that neuron, in this case this green one, to release more neurotransmitters. To be clear, the neurotransmitter here is not necessarily the same as this neurotransmitter here. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. If we look at this slide, which we looked at previously, the binding of the blue neurotransmitter to this neuron is inhibiting this postsynaptic neuron. And we have two main inhibitory neurotransmitters in the body. In the brain, we have GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid. And in the spinal cord, we have glycine. So if this were in the spinal cord and this were glycine binding to this neuron, it would inhibit it, and there'd be no there would be no depolarization event, and hence no release of neurotransmitters down here. In this slide, what we see, an excitatory event, this depolarizes, releases neurotransmitters, exciting this neuron, releasing more neurotransmitters. So the way we can look at this is an example we looked at in a previous video, where the sensory neuron in the hand, when the hand was placed on a hot stove, detected an elevated temperature, causing this sensory neuron to depolarize, going to the spinal cord, activating a neuron in the spinal cord, causing that to depolarize, going up to the brain and telling a neuron to go move the arm and move the hand off of the stove. Now, certainly in that example, I left out a number of different neurons in the spinal cord, neurons in the corticospinal tract, neurons in the cerebral cortex, and then the motor neuron as well. This really would be the motor neuron going to the muscles in the hand or arm to lift the hand up. This would be an interneuron, and that would be a sensory neuron.